Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Dangan, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second installment of our Radcliffe Virtual Book Talk series this winter. Before we begin today's program, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors whose generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. I'd also like to take this moment to acknowledge that we've heard from some members of our community who believe that in light of recent events at our own university, we should have canceled this afternoon's program. I'll only say this: a conversation on the issue of gender-based violence with Anita Hill, who has spoken truth to power for 30 years, could not be more important today. My position is that as an institution of higher education, we must seize opportunities to explore issues like this and to engage deeply and openly. We have an obligation to engage thoughtfully with one another, and it is my hope that this afternoon's conversation provides an opportunity for us to do precisely that. Anita Hill is University Professor of Social Policy, Law, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. She's an expert in anti-discrimination law and policy, and she is a leading voice in the ongoing struggle to achieve racial and gender equality. Anita is the author of numerous publications, including Reimagining Equality, Stories of Gender, Race, and Finding Home. And she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and the recipient of many awards and honors. This afternoon, Anita will share from her most recent book, Believing, our 30-year journey to end gender violence. In 1991, Anita's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee sparked a national conversation about sexual harassment and violence. And Believing seeks to expand that reckoning to encompass the full scope of gender-based violence, which Anita describes as a range of violent and coercive behaviors, including various forms of physical, psychological, and financial abuse. In her powerful new book, Anita discusses the ways in which gender-based violence is embedded in and perpetuated by cultural and societal structures. And she considers what our leaders and our nation must do to effect change. We'll begin our program with a brief reading from Anita, after which she'll engage in conversation with Evelynn Hammonds. Evelynn is chair of the Department of the History of Science, Barbara Gutmann Rosenkrantz Professor of the History of Science, and Professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard. Her scholarship examines the history of scientific, medical, and socio-political concepts of race and gender in the United States. And she also works on projects to improve the representation of women of color in STEM fields. She's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Following Anita and Evelynn's conversation, we'll turn to audience questions. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any point during the program. We only ask that you keep your questions brief so we can address as many of them as possible. And now it is my distinct pleasure to give the virtual floor to Anita Hill.
Thank you, Dean Brown-Dangan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this program and giving me a chance to talk about my book, Believing. I'm also very happy to be here and answering questions from Professor Hammonds, as well as from you and the audience who are here today. And thank you for joining me. I am very excited in this moment because we have heard the announcement by President Biden that he will be appointing a judge and that he intends to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And that will be a monumental moment in the U.S. history that I'm looking forward to. And I'm looking forward to what discussions that we're going to have around that nomination. I think it could be an important moment for us to understand both race and gender and how they intersect in today's world, and then the importance of having representation on the Supreme Court. So I'm looking forward to all of that. But in thinking about judging, I came across an article that was written just a few weeks ago, but it was an article in the Washington Post about a letter that Pauli Murray sent to President Nixon in 1971, in which she nominated herself, or submitted her name to President Nixon for his consideration for a nomination for the Supreme Court. There was an opening, and she felt that she was infinitely qualified, and she absolutely was. Had Nixon taken her up on her suggestion, she would have been the first African American woman to be on the Supreme Court, and I think that would have, in so many ways, changed the course of legal history. Um, However, one of the things that she did do was to suggest that she had models for judging. And one of those models is a man named Spotswood Robinson, who I do feature in my book because of his work on the early cases involving claims of sexual harassment. So today I'm going to read a piece from that book, or taken from the book, about why Spotswood Robinson was so important and an important figure in the history of sexual harassment law, and I believe in gender-based violence altogether. So today we really do take for granted federal legal protections against sexual harassment. However, a string of early rulings in the 1970s went against women who argued that sexual harassment was a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The decisions were typically based on presumptions that the offensive behavior that women were complaining about was natural, either a result of biology or normal, and too common to curtail. As the court's thinking went at that moment, men naturally demanded sex, and women had either to comply when they were on the job or move on to another job. Even though sexual harassment resulted in workplace inequalities, these early courts saw it as a personal inconvenience that the law had never intended to address. Had this thinking prevailed, it might have derailed the recognition of anti-harassment protections altogether. By the late 1970s, the outcomes in these cases pointed squarely to the need for a judge with a different approach to civil rights. A different judging is what I like to say. As it turns out, Spotswood Robinson III would be what the law and what plaintiffs needed. Robinson was Black, born in 1916 in Richmond, Virginia. He had experienced racism firsthand. He was educated in segregated schools, and he got his law degree from the historically Black college, Harvard University, in their School of Law in 1939. There, he studied under Charles Hamilton Houston, whose early legal strategies led to the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. As a young lawyer, Robinson litigated race discrimination cases and saw racism through the eyes of his clients, some of whom, unlike Robinson, were poor and illiterate. In the segregated South, Robinson sat across from opposing counsels who argued that segregation and other forms of racism were natural and in the best interest of both races. In 1954, in Washington, D.C., Robinson stood before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court and delivered an oral argument in favor of the Black plaintiffs in the Brown versus Board of Education. The representative plaintiff in that case was a a girl named Linda Brown and her parents. As a Johnson appointee to the federal court in 1964, Spotswood Robinson served in the same judiciary system as the white judges who denied women's sexual harassment claims. But Robinson's experience as both a lawyer and a judge convinced him that the sexual extortion that early plaintiffs complained about was a civil rights violation, was in fact a civil rights violation. Judge Robinson looked at Title VII's language and noted that it protected race and sex similarly, and that civil rights protection should be progressive, forward-looking, and expansive. So in 1977, when Paulette Barnes complained that the Environmental Protection Agency abolished her job because she rejected her male supervisor's sexual advances, she could not have had a better judge than Robinson. Judge Robinson was known for his attention to detail, whether the details were legal or factual or historical. His Barnes v. Castle opinion, which is the case that Paulette Barnes brought, his opinion in that case is notable first for capturing the workplace power dynamics that culminated in the suits. Earlier opinions had all but eliminated the facts behind the claims that the early plaintiffs had brought. But the crux of Miss Barnes' story, and it was filled out in full detail in the Barnes v. Castle opinion, the crux of it was that Miss Barnes began working at the EPA as an administrative assistant in a sort of an entry-level position. And almost immediately, her supervisor started making repeated sexual advances, soliciting her to join him for social activities after office hours, directing sexual comments to her, and suggesting that she would get a promotion if she had sex with him. Miss Barnes rejected his overtures. In time, her supervisor began to belittle her, stripped her of her job duties, and finally fired Barnes, in essence, by eliminating her job. And these dynamics seem so familiar now, but in 1977, when this case was decided, those kinds of dynamics were not spelled out and not actually discussed in opinions. Judge Robinson noted, though, that Paulette Barnes was Black, as were several of the other women in prior sexual harassment cases. This was also something novel because this was not a race discrimination case. It was a sex discrimination case. But as a son of the South, Robinson would understand how they, Barnes and the other plaintiffs, because of their race, might have a peculiar vulnerability to sexual misconduct owing to both gender and race. Now, this is where judging really comes in addition to spelling out the facts, making the case for ultimate decision. In writing the court's decision in favor of Barnes, Robinson applied the same thinking to gender bias as he applied to racial bias. And that meant the law was obligated to put aside culturally based presumptions about male entitlements in the same way that the law would deny white racial privileges. And in speaking with a line of reasoning, and in breaking with a line of reasoning that stood in the way of women's claims for protection, Judge Robinson strategically laid the grounds for his court's decision in favor of the plaintiff Barnes. He summed up Barnes' case in clear language. Paulette Barnes became the target of her superior's sexual desires because she was a woman. And she was asked to bow to his demands as the price for holding her job. That was enough to support her claim that she was being discriminated against in employment on the basis of her sex. And Robinson, citing the legislative history of the Civil Rights Act and linking the relatively new claim of sexual harassment to more developed race discrimination law, assured that sex harassment would be, quote, accorded the same degree of social concern given to any type of unlawful discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I am so excited about this conversation, but I want to begin before we get to questions to acknowledge that we are in the midst of a controversy that is roiling the Harvard campus, as Dean Brown-Nagin said. And these are on the very issues that you have addressed in your new book. So I just want to make a couple of points. As a member of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, I signed a letter earlier this week that I believed raised a number of questions about the procedures that had been followed with respect to sexual harassment charges brought against one of my colleagues. So my intent in signing the letter was merely to draw attention to very particular issues. What I believed at the time was a lack of transparency with respect to very important and essential processes. And so the letter, though, has been read as supporting the accused, I should say, and questioning the veracity of the students who brought forth the charges. That was never what I intended, and I truly regret signing the letter. This has been a difficult and soul-searching moment. And after receiving additional information, I've retracted my name from the statement. And I want to state that I absolutely stand with the students in this case. And I want to state that I completely support them and I applaud their enormous courage in bringing their charges forward and making these charges known to us all. I can think of no better time to be in a conversation with you about this. I have long been familiar with the destructive power of gender-based violence. I still have a lot more to learn. I know that this conversation will give us all the opportunity to do so. So now I want to pick up on the point you just made about Judge Robinson's actions in 1977 that made that critical link between race discrimination and sex discrimination, because it's so important to the story that you tell in Believing. So I wondered if you could just begin by telling us why you think it took so long for others in law and politics to recognize and act on that link, in which was so evident in your experience testifying before Congress in 1991?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that in 1991, we really had a lot to learn. And, it took 30 years to write Believing, and every day I'm learning. And certainly I've learned a lot since 1991. And if I could just sum up in part why it took so long for us to catch up with where Judge Robinson was in 1977 to be able to connect with the idea of sex discrimination and harassment with race, is that we just didn't know, and we didn't live in a world where people were led to understand it. Remember, this was before we had the concept of intersectionality, for example. And all of these things were emerging. But specifically with regard to why I believe the Senate Judiciary Committee and other members of the Senate didn't understand the connection, couldn't see where my experience with sexual harassment fit with any kind of legal concern that should be raised, or any kind of ethical concern or conflict, or question about character and fitness for the court, was that they didn't understand vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really was well, I shouldn't say they didn't understand vulnerability at all. I think they did understand political vulnerability,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they couldn't understand the vulnerability of any woman who is in a workplace, just like the workplaces that were being described in those early cases, and what that meant, how we react in those workplaces, how the decisions, the difficult decisions that we often have to make in order to function in the workplaces that we exist in. They couldn't appreciate things, and so would ask questions like, well, why didn't you just leave?
Right, right, right.
Because these were powerful men,
Mm-hmm.
and they were in a process that was about their political power to make a choice about who should sit on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And I think it never really did occur to them that there could be other things to think about
Mm-hmm.
in terms
Mm-hmm.
of whether or not the nominee was fit for the
Right,
position.
right.
I don't think they had, secondly, I don't think they had any knowledge of Black women's history.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was so important in the weeks that followed, well, actually, in a few days that followed my testimony, was the group called African American Women in Defense of Ourselves that
Yes.
tried to educate not only the Senate, but also the public
Right.
about our experiences.
Yes. Yes.
But, that wasn't something that I'm sure that history was not being taught to those men who were making the decision in 1991.
Yes.
And the public then, I believe, saw the hearing through the eyes and experience of the people in power,
Right. Right.
and not the people, the victims and survivors, myself included,
Mm-hmm.
from our point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of that was lost. I think we're starting to learn more. As I say, it's been 30 years and we've learned a lot since then. There's still much more to be learned, because
Right.
those issues, there still is this question about what is the nexus, and what are the complications when you have gender-based violence
Right.
that exists in the lives of women of color,
Yes.
particularly Native women, Latinx women, and Black women.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all sort of different depending on which group we are talking about. There's
Mm-hmm.
some commonalities, of course, but there are also some differences. I think we're learning more. I
Right.
think there's much more to be learned.
Yes.
But I think it all starts with how we understand vulnerability, and
Mm.
whether or not we can get beyond our own experiences and understand vulnerability for other people.
I.
And let me just add that I think Spotswood Robinson, and I talk about the fact that he represented Black plaintiffs who were poor and illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he understood that what their experience was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
He was not
Exactly.
himself poor.
Right.
Didn't grow up poor. He was well educated, but he also knew that the fact that he was Black made him vulnerable,
Yes. Yes.
whether inside that
Yes.
courtroom or
Yes.
outside.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. Right. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that lived his lived he could make that connection through his lived experience. And in believing, you use your experience and the numerous accounts of women who wrote to you to chart this sort of back and forth on gender equity issues in the first part of the century. And you give this very searing and powerful narrative, I think, that illuminates the different kinds of cultural, systemic, political factors that interact to rationalize what you call, and I love this, that quote, it's not so bad attitude, unquote. The way people, and that's the way people sort of think about many forms of gender-based violence. It's not so bad. So tell us what you've, a little bit about what you've learned over the last 30 years about that attitude.
Well, how much time do we have here? But how do I sum it up? I
Okay.
summed up the first question in terms of vulnerability.
Yes.
I would sum up our reaction over the last 30 years to denial and dismissiveness.
Mhm.
There is this tendency of denial, and I talk a little bit about it and drew on my very limited background in psychology to talk about it in the sense that when we see situations where we are where we even know that they're dangerous and causing injury, our tendency when we don't see an immediate solution
Mhm.
is to just deny that there's a problem.
Problem. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
And that's a sort of a reaction, a psychological reaction. But
Mhm.
it's also then something that becomes built in our culture,
Mhm.
so that we tell our children, that when a person is harming them, especially young children,
Mhm.
we tell them, it's not that bad.
Mhm.
Or in some cases, we even punish children for telling. So don't, we tell them, don't be a tattletale.
Mhm. Right.
And in a sense, what we are doing is denying that child's pain.
Exactly. Exactly.
And but we are also supporting the other child's right to be abusive.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that really is an important place for us to start
Yes.
in terms of how we can begin to think about solutions to this problem.
Right.
It's
Right.
like, oh, and one of the experiments that a group did after reading the book was that they went around the office and talked to adults. And this person talked to the women in the office and asked them how many times they had been told over the course of their lives to not make a big deal out of something that was happening to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and what they said was over and over, women were saying, "Yeah, this is what I have been told all my life. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's not that bad.
Mhm.
Just, or in other words, just get over it
Right.
yourself. Fix the
Right.
problem yourself, if it's a problem at all." And I invite people to kind of think about their own experiences,
Mhm.
to whether they have ever heard that that phrase or some variation on that phrase.
Right.
I think, and I go back to this, what we're talking about is a problem that doesn't start as in adulthood. I know from the research that I have been doing for 30 years, and certainly what I've put in the book, is that it's starting at a very early age.
Yes.
Uh, and at a very early age, we're giving children wrong messages,
Mhm.
and that we can shape their behavior much better if we're honest about what this problem is and we are knowledgeable about what problems that we think of as sort of boys be boys behavior
Exactly.
can lead to.
Mhm.
And the evidence is there that this kind of pulling and teasing and hitting and sexual aggression that happens, kinds of pinching and slurs that happen, that are aimed at girls and often queer children um, really can ultimately lead to much more violent behavior, violent sexual assault, and teen dating. We know that these are precursors.
Right.
And so we have to respond early. So
Right.
that denial, when I say denial and dismissiveness, it's not just about what's happening to adults, because it is happening to adults in workplaces, but it's also happening to children.
Yes.
And we can stop it at that age.
Yes.
And I think prevent things happening when they become
Later
adults.
on. Right. The I mean, I think that's I love that answer, and I think I want to turn because I think
But can I
people
just
want
say
to hear
one
about
more
that.
thing, though?
Of course
Just
you can.
one more thing
Of course you
about that, and this is maybe my personal pet peeve, because in addition to telling girls not to make a big deal out of it, don't make a fuss,
can.
because we're supposed to be nice and go along and get along with everyone. Um, we sometimes we tell girls that if a boy teases you, if they even if they call you names, even if they pull down your pants,
Hmm.
they're doing it because they like you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes.
I mean, and to me, if we could just stop that, I mean, even we'll get to this other not so bad part, but if we gotta stop telling
Right.
girls that the way a person shows them that they
Exactly.
like them is by hurting them.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
Exactly.
we got to teach, if that is what we believe boys are trying to express, we've got to teach them how to better express themselves.
Exactly. Exactly. So I totally agree. We have to get into this much more earlier than we have been thinking about, and I really appreciate that. Um, your last chapter is called accountability, and I know people want to hear about this. And you speak about in the section duty and danger, among other things, you call for what I completely agree, better reporting of data on the frequency of gender harassment. That would help so much if we had that. But also, I was most struck by what you said in the section on deliberate and intentional action, that we are now in a period of reckoning about gender-based violence. And how do you want us to face this reckoning? Um, you definitely say, don't just throw up your hands, you got to do something. But what else do you want us to think about in terms of facing this reckoning?
Well, first of all, I want us to broaden our thinking. One of the questions that I keep getting is, why did you put harassment, sexual harassment, and gender harassment in with some behavior, sexual assault, and rape?
Mhm.
And I mean, and I understand that there are differences, but I also understand that there are some very similarities, and the roots of those behaviors are very close to each other. I, I think we think too narrowly about what is a violation.
Mhm.
I think that we believe, and this is true of intimate partner violence, it is true of things that happen in the workplace and happen in our schools. We think that if there's not a broken bone or there's not a physical assault, then there should not be a violation. We're looking for the bruises and the bones. We're looking for that egregious behavior. And
Yeah.
even then, we're not always sure that we want to respond. Um, I think we are actually behind the times with the rest of the world in thinking about the economic harassment and abuse that people take, the psychological and emotional abuse that happens.
Mhm.
I was speaking to a group of lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers, who do civil rights work, and um, they were saying that we need to expand the law even to deal with what we call microaggressions,
Mhm.
because these can have a cumulative effect. So I think we need to catch up with the rest of the world. The United Nations has been looking at gender violence across the globe, and they take a much broader view
Mhm.
of what we're talking about. And
Mhm.
I think that we in this country need to get beyond the idea that people have to come in broken and bloodied in order to raise a claim. And we see that not only, as I said, in sexual harassment cases and sexual assault cases, but we even, that is even built in to many of our standards when we're dealing with rape.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that I would say is that right now, in terms of response to gender-based violence, we sort of follow what I call a legal intervention that is retribution, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Our intervention is to put people in jail. That's our way of thinking about it. It's to have law enforcement come in, and this is when law enforcement does pursue these claims, and very often there are criminal charges that could apply, but law enforcement doesn't pursue them
Right.
because, district attorneys and other prosecutors don't think that they can get a prosecution.
Sure.
But even then, the system is about retribution. And what I think we need to think about is other forms of legal interventions
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that bring in victims and people who are complaining into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, very often, they are not involved. They have no say in how things are going to be done. And in fact, in many communities of color, they complain when a victim comes forward, they complain that they are very often treated as someone who has, in fact, been caused been acting criminally, as
Right.
opposed to the person that they're accusing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this idea that law enforcement is the only way to deal with
Mm-hmm.
the problem of gender-based violence. And that doesn't mean law enforcement shouldn't ever be involved, but to think that's the only way we're going to deal with it, I think really just waits till after the problem happens.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think what we should be doing are some social interventions beforehand. Because I teach in a school for policy and because I'm a lawyer, I think that the government has to play a much more immediate and much more certain
Mm-hmm.
role in understanding some of the factors that can contribute to the possibility of gender-based violence, so that there be social interventions around economics and economic sustainability for people who are vulnerable, especially women and non-binary people and trans people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
I think we need to look at the role that we could play in terms of how we can make sure that people have affordable housing, that will help
Mm-hmm.
reduce some of the problems of intimate partner and family violence.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, yes, we need to look closely at this as a health issue, and look at some health, mental health, and physical health and well-being measures that can keep people from becoming vulnerable
Right.
to the problem.
Yes.
I just think that to look at the problem of gender violence simply through the lens of policing and law enforcement is not ever going to solve the problem.
I.
It's only going to wait until it happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's really sort of part of what I mean when I think the reckoning has to happen, but it cannot continue in the same way that we traditionally would like to see it continue in.
Right. Thank you. We have to move to Q&A now and see what other folks want to understand. The first question I want to turn to, because I think it fits in with what you just said. The question is, what do you think grassroots advocates and other citizens can do to end gender-based violence? Because I'm sorry, gender-based violence. Because you've talked about the legal, you've talked about the health, but I think people want to know is, what can I do myself?
Well, one of the things that I think is that we are in charge, I think, more than the government. Even though the government can persuade us to change cultural ideas, I mean, we've had it happen by changing our culture around smoking and drinking and driving. But we can, I think, we are the drivers of culture, and even changing the way we talk to our children
Mm-hmm.
about uh, gender violence is a way of changing our culture. I think we can do more in our schools.
Mm-hmm.
So much of what happens is because people don't have the knowledge and understanding of an issue. And if you don't have a knowledge and understanding of an issue, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. You're not going to be able to even begin to understand the roots of the problem. So you're not going to know how to address it. I think more can be done in our schools in terms of you know you know people. I think people get a little anxious because they think, well, how can we teach kids about gender violence? Well, they're experiencing it. They're
Yes, right.
experiencing it. How can we not teach them
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
about ways to address it and ways to deal with it in a productive way?
Mm-hmm.
Because we know it's already happening. We don't know exactly how much of it's happening.
Right.
And I talk about how some of that data is missing. And that's one of the reasons I say we need to collect more information.
Mm-hmm.
But we do know enough to know
Mm-hmm.
that it's happening in our
Happening.
schools today,
Mm-hmm.
and that we need schools to be places where we can come together and get reliable information.
Mm-hmm.
Advocacy groups, I think, have an important role to because right now the schools are not doing it.
Yes.
So how I think the role is to keep doing what they're doing with more resources, and that can happen because local and state governments provide the resources, because federal governments make sure that we provide the resources that we need for these kinds of problems that we know have been going on throughout our lives, and are destined to go on through the next generations if we don't do something about it. So, I think there are ways, the roles that we're playing. I'm, associated with uh, legal groups that
Mm-hmm.
are advocacy groups. And so, we are doing things to provide information, to set up different procedures and to advocate for policies
Mm-hmm.
for how we can address problems in various locations, including sexual assault and harassment in the universities as well as
Yeah.
in workplaces.
I think that point, pointing to university, speaks to one of the questions that came in. This person would like to hear your response to the question of due process, best process, when privacy and confidentiality are critical, but a lack of trust in the system leads to communities wanting a public way to be part of these adjudicated claims. And they continue that Title IX is a flawed tool. The sexual violence on campus affects more than 1/4 of students. And do you have any ideas about better tools that would, engage, different ways, I think, of thinking about privacy protections, especially in educational institutions, in colleges and universities?
Well, the question that you ask is a good question, but even as you're reading it, I think people will understand how complicated it
Of
is.
course it is, yes.
There are protections
Mhm.
of privacy in schools, um, and they're understandable. We know that we need to. I mean, we've got people living in community with each other that have no real relationship with each other except that they're all members of the university community. So you've got to work to protect their privacy. But at a point, sometimes protections of privacy can conflict with safety protections
Mm-hmm.
because there are no real interventions. And there are also ways that privacy can limit our ability to address the Title IX problems because our systems are not transparent enough to provide people in the community with an understanding of just how decisions are being made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, if this sounds familiar,
Mm-hmm.
it should.
Yes.
But it's not something that's unique to any one university.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that is a problem with the way that we have tried to balance out these two different protections.
Yes. Yeah.
And they are things that have to be worked out right now. To the, it's being worked out community by community, which means that there are no national standards.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that what we need to do is ultimately get to figure out what are the best ways for us to think about privacy uh, and to think about protecting people from violence in the same way.
Yes.
And not only for those individuals, but for the entire community so that the
Mm-hmm.
entire community knows what the community standard
What the community
is
standard
for
is.
these
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah. Right. 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 There's another question that asks about how um, this business about male aggression, boys being taught and sanctioned to be able to be aggressive. The question is, how does this relate to gender violence that is not males abusing females, for instance, but rather females who have power over males abusing them? How would this address the ways in which you talked about denial and dismissal earlier?
I talk about the fact that we have to first find a place for males to be able to talk about their abuse. Right now, we don't have it.
Mhm.
It's very, very difficult in our society for males to admit that they have been abused because it then puts them in a category of not being man enough.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and we link being able to come forward and to share when you've been abused with masculinity
Yes.
in ways that are really, really harmful. Um, and so, it's something I talk about, and it really doesn't matter whether the abuser is a male or a female. I don't know that it's any harder for boys or men to admit that they've been abused by a female than it is for them to acknowledge that they've been abused by
Mhm.
a male.
Right.
I just think we make it very hard for men to talk about. And I think, once again, this is one of those areas we're going to have to address. And I think, I keep telling people when I talk about this, I believe that at the root of that, uh, telling boys to be quiet and it's a one version of that not so bad
Mhm.
thing that we tell. But at the root of it, I think, is uh, homophobia
Mhm.
and our um, this idea that, again, whatever a person's sexual identity is, they will be castigated as not manly enough and therefore deserving
Mhm.
of the abuse that they experience.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so that's a cultural issue that we need to get over.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, but and I talk in the book about how um, there are groups that are working on this
Mm-hmm.
issue, but it's not. It's again one of those things that need to be addressed very young, because we are teaching gender roles at a very early age. It's coming through our culture, it's coming through games and gaming, it's coming through television and movies. And in so many ways, we are teaching the wrong lessons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is so much more to ask you, but I want to give you a little time to reflect. You've been dealing with these issues of gender-based violence in your personal life, in your professional life, now for over 30 years. And so, can you tell us what gives you hope right now?
Yes, I've been dealing with them for years, and honestly, I've been dealing with the experiences of other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and in some ways, that's why I wrote Believing, not because of what happened to me in 1991, but because of how much I've heard from people
Mm-hmm.
since 1991.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we have made some advances. That gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
We have in this country and in other parts of the world, and sometimes led by leadership, and especially in terms of the United Nations. But we've made some advances in terms of just the public sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
The public, we're having conversations that we never would have had
Absolutely.
30 years ago. It
Mm-hmm.
was just like, when I tell students, it was 30 years ago, people didn't even know there was a law against harassment. They think I must be talking about 100 years ago.
Right.
But it wasn't that long ago. And I see how far we've come in those 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
But so that gives me hope. And I also began to see that we're starting to see how our systems and structures have failed us.
Mm-hmm.
And that also gives me hope, because I know that we've got to address this problem on several fronts.
Mm-hmm.
We got to address it on a cultural front. We have to address it in terms of our systems, and then we've got to address it in terms of our structures.
Mm-hmm.
Some structures are protective. Organizations protect what they think is their reputation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the default action.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we are starting to understand that protecting your reputation depends on you protecting the people within your organization. There's a case out there now in gaming, Blizzard Activision, and it's been in the Wall Street Journals. Microsoft has now bought the company,
Mm-hmm.
bought Blizzard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Blizzard was making lots of money. They thought that they could deal with the abuse that was going on at Blizzard behind the scenes
Mm-hmm.
in order to cover up and protect their reputation.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, because they did such a bad job, and because people spoke out, they found out that their reputation was gone, and they were vulnerable to a takeover.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, you know, that those small things in that one company even gives me hope that
Okay.
we will start to focus on the things that we should be prioritizing, protecting people, and that we can move forward
Mm-hmm.
to make the changes that we need to. So lots of things give me hope. Um, but the best thing that I guess I can say is that I'm very hopeful because I see every day that people are working to make the world safer.
Right. Thank you. My goodness, our time has been way too short. There's so much more to say, but now I want to thank you for believing all these 30 years. And I really want to thank you for believing that we can make a better future and a better world together. It has been a true honor. And so now I have to thank everyone for joining us today, for the terrific questions, for the conversation. And this concludes our program. I want to thank uh, the Anita Hill, of course, and also let you all know that today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. And also to encourage you to look at the Radcliffe virtual programs website and see other events and the coming events. And there's lots happening this spring that I'm sure you'll want to participate in. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and take care.